Yeah, the Nordic sun really burns.
Yeah. All right, we're live. So I should. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new season of the Theory from the Margins lecture series. I am Patrick Brock, a research fellow at the University of Oslo, and I will be moderating today's session. Please keep an eye on our website and Facebook page for further details about our next guests. Before we move on to introducing today's speaker, I would like to say a few words about who we are and what we do. The Theory from the Margins collective deep reads and current scholarship on post-colonial theory, the decolonial turn, and theory building from the global south. The collective reads works for marginalized communities in the global north and south, as well as critical interventions based on in-depth studies of marginalized groups. Theory from the Margins is primarily interested in the contemporary global academia's engagement with what we understand to be theory, and it aims to spark broader discussions about theoretical concepts outside of academia. I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Merv Tabor from the University of Utrecht and the University of Oslo, and by research fellow Theang Theron from the Norwegian School of Theology and Society. Without further ado, I now leave the floor to Merve to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll go ahead and introduce today's speaker, Professor Premesh Lalu. After obtaining a master's degree from the University of the Western Cape, Professor Premesh Lalu was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship to obtain a doctorate in history at the University of Minnesota, which he defended in 2003. Following his return to the University of Western Cape, and after 16 years in the Department of History as an associate professor, Lalu was awarded an Andrew Mellon Foundation grant to convene a fellowship program on the study of the humanities in Africa. He was promoted to full professor upon being appointed as director of the Center for Humanities Research in 2008, a position he held until 2019. Under his leadership, the center was awarded the Department of Science and Innovation National Research Foundation flagship on critical thought in African humanities. In 2019, Lalu was awarded a writing fellowship at the Humanities Long Room at Trinity College, Dublin. And in 2022, Lalu took up a post at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, United Arab Emirates. His monograph, Undoing Apartheid, was published by UK-based Polity Press in November 2022. Lalu has published widely in academic journals on historical discourse and the study of the humanities, and is a regular contributor of public opinion pieces on the arts and humanities. His articles have appeared in History and Theory, Journal of Southern African Studies, Critical Times, Konos Southern African Histories, Economic and Political Weekly, and the South African Historical Journal. In Undoing Apartheid, which Dr. Lalu will discuss today, Lalu underlines the importance of an aesthetic education for envisioning futures beyond apartheid. To trace these post-apartheid visions, he examines three theatrical works by William Kentridge, Jane Taylor, and the Handspring Puppet Company: Faustus in Africa, Woyzeck on the Highveld, and Ubu and the Truth Commission. These works coincided with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of apartheid. Lalu's interpretation of these works shows the beginnings of contemporary race theory and emphasizes the need for truth-based post-apartheid reconciliation, if only to preserve the past's poetic connection to optimism and to an education of desire. He eloquently breaks down the constitutive organs of the apartheid body while rejecting the discourse of mourning so prevalent among many theorists today. Instead, he invests his theory with a call for new ways of thinking and building possible presence. Without further ado, I welcome you, Dr. Premesh Lalu, and leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Professor Tabor. Just one correction, I'm back in Cape Town. I've since left the Africa Institute, and I'm now back at the University of the Western Cape at the Center for Humanities Research. But thank you very, very much for that very warm welcome. And as well to Patrick Brock and Theang Theron. I know I've been I was just apologizing before we went live about what a bad correspondent I am. And the excuse I have is perpetual cycles of load shedding in South Africa, which no longer actually holds. I'm just a very bad correspondent, so I'm really sorry for all the to and fro, but I'm really grateful to be here today. And thank you for giving me some space in this really wonderful forum. And I know of Professor Chattopadhyay's work. I've followed many of the conversations that have happened on this forum. So I'm really grateful to be invited into this forum and to participate in a conversation about a book that has taken me many, many years to think through. I shall tell you just the small anecdote about it. I had completed many of the chapters while I was at the Trinity College Longroom Hub, very inspired by encountering Seamus Heaney. I'll say a little bit about that, particularly a play he did in 1990 called The Cure at Troy, which was a gift to Nelson Mandela, with those lines that sometimes gets misquoted by American presidents about the rhyme of hope and history. But I got back to Cape Town and my house was burgled and all my hard drives with the book were surrendered to the subaltern of Cape Town. So when the lockdown happened and we had a very hard lockdown, I sat down and reconstructed what I could of this book. So if there's any, wild departures from what were sometimes thought through ideas over a very long period, I apologize profusely. It's a somewhat difficult book to summarize and to talk about in a short space of time. And I know that many of the colleagues who participate in this forum would not have had an opportunity to read the book. So I'm going to try my best to highlight some of the key features of its argument, and perhaps, in the discussion section, we can open up some of that to further scrutiny. And I suppose I should start by saying that part of the difficulty of the book is that it enacts the argument for an aesthetic education that it urges. So it does the very thing that it's asking us to think about. And it suggests that that might be the only passage to a post-apartheid future, to a desire for the post-apartheid. If, that is, apartheid is understood not merely as a structural condition of race and ethnicity, but as an architectonics of power, if you like, but also as a product of the breakup of the sensory order. And it's that configuration around the sensory order, and I want to say a little bit about that as we proceed, but just to signal that two figures who become critical to both South Africa, but also to the agenda of neoliberalism, have their early gestation, if you like, their early formation in Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig. Now, Friedrich Hayek was inspired by Wundt, amongst others, William James, a number of scholars working in the field of experimental psychology. In 1920, wrote an essay called The Sensory Order before he took up his economics studies. And then in 1952, 4 years after apartheid's formation, had taken to writing the book, The Sensory Order, which Chicago University has just brought out now with a new introduction by Bruce Caldwell. And I've been trying to work through that. Now, this book does not reflect on the sensory order because I had no sight of it when I was writing Undoing Apartheid. But the other figure, Hendrik Verwoerd, who was often thought of as the architect of apartheid, and who I refer to in the book as a lab technician in a minor discipline of recent origin called experimental psychology, also cut his teeth in the field of experimental psychology. In fact, the laboratory that he did his PhD in, which roughly translated would have been something like the blunting of emotions, that laboratory was modeled on Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig. Now, I want to say that Wundt, who is also the author of a 10-volume series called Volkspsychologie, is a very crucial figure and is not as simply one struggles to work through his articulation of a structuralist method in psychology that he is also inventing at the time. But Verwoerd ended up in that laboratory a few years after Wundt had died in 1920 and had engaged in the debates, the Gestalt debates between Berlin and Leipzig. And so part of apartheid, I want to argue, at least that part of apartheid which interests me in this book and which I will talk about in a little bit, that part of apartheid was at least drawn out of those conversations that unfolded through the Leipzig laboratory that Wilhelm Wundt had set up, and that became the foundations of experimental psychology from the 1870s onwards. So I want to say there's something about the desire for the post-apartheid and the refusal to give up on the possibility of thinking the post-apartheid not only as a question for South Africa, but as the promise that it marked in the 1990s as a gift to the world, as a gift to thinking our way out of the scripts of race and of partition in particular that had bedeviled the world. I mean, we think about the partitions after the Second World War, India, Pakistan, the Middle East, Israel, Palestine. We have the word partition that we haven't, I think, sufficiently attended to in our critical approaches to the contemporary world. And I think what I want to put on the table is a need for us to return to the question of partition, and that apartheid might allow us to think about how it is we enter that conversation. In fact, there's something about apartheid that holds together the promise of thinking our way towards something like a post-partition world, or at least a way of troubling the way that partition operates as a political rationality in our times. So one of the motifs in this book, and I want to start here, is the motif of the Trojan horse. And I want in this book to hold up that image of the Trojan horse, because I argue in the pages of this book that it is the Trojan horse of apartheid that was often misapprehended and sometimes ignored, sometimes monumentalized for all the wrong reasons, that continues to haunt the contemporary of South Africa. And that figuration of the Trojan horse is one that recalls the familiar post-colonial anxiety of history calling twice, first time as tragedy and second time as farce. The motif of the Trojan horse, therefore, as it works its way through this text, is both a cautionary tale about apartheid and a specific strategy that we would have to think through in undoing apartheid. Now, it is not incidental or coincidental that I should draw on the metaphor of the Trojan horse. In 1985, when I was part of a student movement fighting against the apartheid state in a neighborhood called Athlone in Cape Town, on the edges of the city of Cape Town, to which large numbers of people had been forcibly removed, there was a massacre that unfolded in the streets which got the name the Trojan Horse Massacre. And for many, many years since 1985, after that massacre in which three young, they were literally young children who were killed in that massacre, I've been troubled both by trying to think about the event of that massacre, but also to think a little bit about the name that was given to that massacre, the Trojan Horse Massacre. And for those of you who have the courage to watch some of the violence of apartheid's kind of orchestrations, there is on YouTube a CBS news clip on the Trojan Horse Massacre, which recorded the event on that day, that fateful day of the 15th of October, 1985. And so there's something about the Trojan Horse that had something of a reality effect in the work that we were engaged in 1985, in the struggles against apartheid. And there were many contentious moments in that struggle, and often overlooked in the interest of narrating that as a generational conflict, as a conflict of young people that had grown tired of apartheid and then engaged in a headlong rush into violent action and so on. And I'm trying to make sense of the larger questions that were at stake in that moment of the Trojan Horse Massacre. The second reason why that Trojan Horse figuration matters is through a reading of a novel that was written in that area by Richard Reeve called Emergency Continued. And it's a novel that tries to think about a central debate in the student movement in 1985. And that is the debate about, on the one hand, what the students were arguing for was a push towards the liberation with, at all costs. So to sacrifice education and to just push right through the barriers of apartheid to a post-apartheid future. And on the other hand, what seemed like a more conservative position, but in retrospect, a more thoughtful position by those like Richard Reeve, who worked at a teacher's training college in the area and had been a writer of this novel, who argued for a little more caution in what education might mean under the circumstances of an emergency. And so this book revisits that debate by asking us to think about what would it have meant if we went along the path that was proposed by Richard Reeve, if we decided to study the problem. Because Reeve was arguing that the students of that generation had stumbled on something that the generation of the Mandelas and the Sobukwes who encountered the first state of emergency had not really seen in apartheid as it had come into a state rationality. And he was saying that the students of 1985 who stumbled on this problem would squander this problem if they did not study it. And so the book is an attempt to take Reeve seriously and to study the problem that we might have missed in the immediacies and urgencies of 1985, to ask what was at stake in education that could not be seen from within the kind of urgencies that had overwhelmed many of us and our senses in that moment in 1985. And then finally, the third reason for thinking the Trojan horse and for turning it into such an important constitutive part of this, this book is to think about this play by Seamus Heaney in 1990, the Irish Nobel laureate, who wrote The Cure at Troy as a gift to Mandela. So, The Cure at Troy, and I want to say a little bit about it, was an attempt to think about the Sophoclean tragedy as a way to think through the educated choices we make in a world riven by partition. So the metaphoricity of the Trojan horse places the geographical coordinates of apartheid's violence in relation to its global constellation and emergence. It's an attempt to think across hemispheres, to think along a problem of apartheid, not just one that came into being in the aftermath of the Second World War as a political rationality after fascism, but one that held a very, very contrived and deceptive political condition in place. And I'm trying to think about that deceptive plot of apartheid. So not simply one that becomes obvious to us in the kind of archive of apartheid, but one that is hidden from view and yet is the site of a psychic breach in the everyday. So in the final analysis, then, this distribution of apartheid's dialectic of myth and reason makes it, I want to argue, indispensable for understanding the racial formations of what we today call neoliberalism. So there's something in the problem of apartheid, something embedded, deeply embedded in its condition, in its rationality, but also its mythic conditions, that is beginning to suggest itself as a way to think about the problem of neoliberalism. Something that of the sensory order that I think is often eclipsed in our overly hasty attempts to describe its economic rationality, neoliberalism's economic rationality. And I want to call attention to this problem, the shared problem between apartheid and neoliberalism that I'm calling the sensory order, and to think about what goes on in the name of the sensory order. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me retreat a little bit. The Trojan horse of apartheid was not merely, therefore, I'm arguing, eventful, but also uneventful. If anything, beyond its intensification of violence, apartheid was experienced as interminable in its many psychic breaches, with devastating and enduring consequences. This distinction between the eventfulness and the uneventfulness of apartheid neatly maps onto the operative division between what was called grand apartheid, that is best exemplified as a condition of social engineering, and what was called petty apartheid, a banal, uneventful, everyday version of apartheid that was mediated by technical systems of communication and control. So if you want this crisply put, I'm saying that apartheid was experienced not once, but as its name suggests, twice, as grand apartheid and as petty apartheid. And that what we should hear in the word apartheid is not only segregation that took place through the distributions and movements of populations, forced relocations of populations, through group areas acts, through turning ethnicities into kind of homeland structures or sites of homeland structures and so on, but also this petty apartheid that was the rule of parts, that was a partitioning of sense and perception, if you like, a breakup of the sensory order in the interest of producing a society of control, of population control. So petty apartheid is my particular concern in undoing apartheid, because I'm arguing that while we've attended to the big problem of grand apartheid through various instruments of constitution making and creating new legislative frameworks for transcending apartheid's racial and ethnic distributions and so on, we've largely ignored, to our own peril, the problem of petty apartheid. And in fact, petty apartheid is the deceptive plot. Despite its name, the Trojan horse, if you like, despite its name, it was the most pernicious and enduring form of apartheid. So the deception is in its name. By calling it petty apartheid, by rendering it inconsequential. And in the 1980s, the National Party, the party of Verwoerd that instituted apartheid, had started the reform process in South Africa and started giving up on petty apartheid because it had seeped so deep into the tissue and fabric of the society that one could orchestrate forms of control from within it and through it. And so I'm saying that petty apartheid has eluded us and that we ought to be really seriously concerned about it, partly because it now shows up within the problem that we identify as neoliberalism. So this modality of race that is passed, that I'm calling petty apartheid, had a long gestation period. I want to argue that it is not a product of the post-Second World War, but can in fact be traced back to the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. And I want to argue that the abolition of slavery allowed for a seepage of an idea of race that was passed from one technical system to another towards the end of a society of communication and control, and of course consumption, and that we find constellated in the problem of biopolitics. So this figuration of race, entropic as it was what was the remains of slavery that was passed from one technical system to another. And race, in some sense, is identifiable by its attachment to these shifts in the technological objects or technological temporal objects, as Bernard Stiegler would have called them. So, if one were to do a tracing of this emergent form of race, and I'm making the argument that race is an unstable category. It is not a stable category at all. And apartheid is able to manipulate the instability that is associated with something like race. But it's traceable from the end of slavery to the birth of psychotechnics or experimental psychology in the early 20th century, to the rise of automated machines with the rise of cybernetics in 1948, the same year that apartheid and partition, in fact, in many parts of the world, becomes a reality, until it settles in this idea of petty apartheid in South Africa. So I make this argument in the book through reading a template of aesthetic works that allow us to piece together a genealogy, if you like, of petty apartheid, of this Trojan horse of petty apartheid, which is unavailable generally in the archive of apartheid's atrocity. So one can go to the archive and you'll find, until it enters the juridical system, you will find, there's a breach, a transgression, and that gets recorded. But in general, the operations of petty apartheid are not discernible through the archive. And I take my cue from several works of art, and to think the aesthetic as a site of the distribution of the sensible, and where the senses and the sensory order are beginning to be convened, dismembered, disaggregated, and so on and so forth. And I want to just say that one of the inspiring moments in coming to this conclusion that this petty apartheid had a longer gestation was a visit to the Irish National Gallery. And I came across a painting by Francis Danby called The Opening of the Sixth Seal. You can Google it, it's available online. And Danby's painting, is a work of the apocalyptic sublime. In fact, it was so terrifying. And it was, it traveled across to New York, and it was in the UK. It was shown around the world, and people invested. They bought shares in the painting. So it's the rise of the art market, if you like. And at some point, someone was going to win this work. But the Joyce children, James Joyce and his siblings, were taken by the governors to go see this painting every Sunday to instill the fear of the wrath of God in them. So before you had horror flicks on Netflix, you had Francis Danby's Opening of the Sixth Seal. And there was a painting of fallen symbols of the sovereign, a land that is rent with destruction, a slave with arms outstretched to the heavens as if to answer the birth cry of a new world at its turn. And so the painting itself was an abolitionist work, a pro-abolitionist work. And this painting had at its very center an emancipated slave with arms outstretched to the heavens. Now, the point that interests me is that in 1843, someone walked into a gallery in Rochdale in England where the painting was on display and cut out the slave from the canvas. And Danby stitched the slave back into the canvas. So metaphorically, I'm asking us to think about what does it mean to suture that slave back into the canvas. And I'm arguing that is the unfolding of what I'm calling a problematic of race that comes to cohere in something like petty apartheid. So to make this argument, I want to just draw this as my final set of comments. I try to map this through a word that brings together a sense of beholding. The word is theasomai, a Greek word that broadly, I suppose, means conjuring, a beholding, and in which theory and theatre share a common heritage. So this word theasomai allows us to think of the work of theory and theatre as something that we might look forward to, as a speculative horizon, to use the word that we were using before we went live, to think about what lies ahead, thinking ahead, if you like. And I find that, often what is lost to theory now is this idea that theory actually is about a thinking ahead. There's an anticipatory quality. And in fact, the sciences, which I describe in the book through John Herschel and the speculative sciences of astronomy and so on, actually gave to modernity this idea of the speculative horizon of scientific theory. So I'm suggesting that, if in the absence of an archive, we should all go to the theater. Not just any theater. I mean, yes, we should go to any theater as well. But the theater that I want to go look for the constellation that I'm calling petty apartheid can be found in 3 plays that were performed in the 1990s on the cusp of the end of apartheid and the fall of the Berlin Wall. These plays, as was said earlier, were performed by William Kentridge and Handspring Puppet Company, and they had as script writers at various points Lesego Rampolokeng for Faustus in Africa and Jane Taylor for Ubu and the Truth Commission. And there's a line in the one play, Faustus in Africa, which is the first one that I saw in the 1990s by Lesego Rampolokeng, which goes something like, "There is no future for a wound of a slashed. There is no suture for a wound of a slashed future." And it's a striking line about partition and what you do where the wound, as in Seamus Heaney's Kiowa Troy, is a poisoned wound. It's the story of Philoctetes who's been dumped on an island, and Neoptolemus is being sent by Odysseus to get his bow so that they can win the battle over the Trojans. And in some sense, what Faustus in Africa did was to give us a way into thinking about what the question of subjectivity looked like in the wake of apartheid. What is the refiguration of the question of subjectivity in the aftermath of apartheid? Now, it plays on Goethe's Faust. And by bringing the puppet into view and animating the Goethean Faust, particularly Faust II, what it does, it asks us to think about a crisis in Goethe's work, which was written at the time of the abolition of slavery, that the proletarian of Europe, mainly written in Auerbach's tavern in Leipzig, was facing a life that was a slide into mechanized, more and more mechanized forms of life. And, the trouble between desire and the intellect placed on the horizon the question of immaterial labor, which when it is transported to Africa is the site of the invention of something like immaterial labor. So Faustus in Africa really allowed us to see how labor and the concept of labor was being projected onto the colonial world in forms of servitude, in forms of immateriality, in forms of extractive kind of economies, out of which no other subjectivity, no concept of freedom, no concept of a life beyond sheer drudgery was imaginable. And so it put into question this dilemma of the Faustian tragedy between desire and intellectual pursuits as a problem that had devoured the condition of the concept of freedom in Africa and the post-colonial world more generally. So that's the first play, Faustus in Africa, and I find that play so enigmatic and so difficult to work through because its references are all back to that period when Goethe is writing Faust II, which is on the edge of the end of slavery and the revolution in science, particularly in what would become thermodynamics, the revolutions in thermodynamics. And he's worried in the discussions on nature philosophy and so on about, this condition of the European worker would slide into mechanized forms of life. Now, just very quickly, a footnote here, Goethe would go back to the Hellenics to find salvation. And of course, we know that Marx, in that famous line in the 18th Brumaire, would say, let the dead bury the dead, that the revolution of the future would depend on, the poets would offer the revolution of the future, its metaphors and its conditions for coming into being. So I find that play as enthusiastic about the post-apartheid, but at the same time deeply worried about the pacts that are being made, the wagers with the devil, if you like, with Mephistopheles, and what that would lead to in the promise of a new subjectivity after apartheid. The second play is Woyzeck on the Highveld, and that is built also around a play. It's an adaptation of a play by Buchner that was done in 1834 to 1837, also around the period of the abolition of slavery. And it deals with the rise of a disciplinary society and the evisceration of Woyzeck sensibilities. And there I look at the play in relation to the rise of apartheid as an inquiry into the psychic condition and how you reorchestrate psychic life through mnemotechnic objects, through objects that record, replay, in fact, like the cinema, like the camera, and so on and so forth. These enigmatic technologies of communication and control that came into being from the early 20th century onwards. And then finally, Ubu and the Truth Commission, which was written by Jane Taylor, is a remake of Alfred Jarry's early 20th century play about the collision of the human and technology. And I find in that a way to rethink with Benjamin the idea of Mickey Mousing and slapstick, and slapstick as a way of awakening the senses to orient ourselves towards a different kind of relation to the problem of race and apartheid and its inheritances. So I know this is a long meandering, and I know I probably terrified you about this book. I told Polity Press that I wouldn't do this and that I'd try and promote it. I'm at very least, I should tell you that I'm hoping that people would burn the book and not me. But it is an attempt to say that we cannot give up on the struggle for post-apartheid desire, and that the struggle for a post-apartheid desire is not a South African question. It is a question for us to think about in its global frame, in part because apartheid was global to begin with. And as Derrida put it, when they opened the Art Contra Apartheid exhibition in 1983, apartheid was a European creation. So I'll stop there, if that's okay. And I hope I haven't terrified everyone and lost the colleagues who belong to this very important forum.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Premesh, for this inspiring exposition of your ideas, and very much a lot to be considered here. And I'd like to call on Merv to begin the questions, please.
Thank you so much for this insightful talk. So you write about what you call the psychic wreckage of everyday life, stemming from the system of petty apartheid and the way it relied on mnemotechnical objects and the idea of a sensory order. And these elements force their way into everyday lives, pushing people to reconstruct and perform race. And you also propose a certain kind of education, an aesthetic education, to counter this construct. So first question is perhaps like it's too simple, but what does this aesthetic education entail, or how does it translate into a pedagogy for you? And the second question is the success of this strategy of this aesthetic education something we might not be able to see because of the long time scales in which it operates?
Yeah, it's not an easy question at all. It's in fact one of the more challenging questions that I've had to think about since writing the book. And there are 3 points I want to make in answering this question, because I think that this is a conversation that I want to engage in over a longer period with many more colleagues who think about the question of the humanities, its relation to everyday life, to politics, to the public sphere, and so on and so forth. Questions of that we're all engaged with in one form or the other. But this book is a response to many threads and strands of inquiry that have come through engagements in what is called the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, which is a historically Black university in Cape Town. And I've been there, I'm embarrassed to say, for 30 years. Well, I should say that the university should be embarrassed for keeping me around for 30 years, but they have. And it's a university that tried to imagine the post-apartheid in the midst of apartheid's dreaded university segregation policies in the 1980s. And so it declared itself an intellectual home for the democratic left in 1987. And one of the things that had emerged at that university, for me at least, was what was excluded as the disciplinary training that was allowed at a historically Black university. So historically Black universities were very seldom allowed to teach disciplines like medicine, engineering, but they were also refused to teach any of the creative disciplines unless they were training teachers for school. So these were universities set up for administrative purposes, to train a layer of administrators to administer every day petty apartheid, if you like. So in that sense, I lived through what it would mean after apartheid to think our way out of the predicament of apartheid's inheritance at the University of the Western Cape. And the Center for Humanities Research started with the inquiry, that was a general inquiry, about whether we could elaborate a concept of the post-apartheid where no such object existed. And so there have been many fights, many arguments, many disagreements, but also many opportunities to think through the aesthetics and through arts about and philosophy, what we want to manufacture as a concept of the post-apartheid. And one of the projects we undertook was to engage in a project with Handspring Puppet Company that allowed for us to think about breaking up the geographies of apartheid. So to create an arts project in which there would be increased mobilities across geographical spaces. In other words, to enact a theoretical proposition, if you like. Now, so let's just park that there. In other words, there's a substantial behind the scenes engagement that this book is trying to respond to, and to many, many dissertations, graduate student work on what the sensory looks like when you put it against the problem of apartheid. And I'm suggesting that we haven't paid sufficient attention to the sensory order, as I was saying earlier. The second thing about an aesthetic education, as it plays out in the book, is to think a little seriously about that play, The Queue at Troy. Because there's this young Neoptolemus who is caught between a deceptive Odysseus, who only wants the bow, Heraclitus' bow from Philoctetes. And there's the wounded Philoctetes, who is desiring his freedom. And Neoptolemus is caught between a wounded Philoctetes and a deceptive Odysseus, and has to find his own way out of that predicament. And he has to make certain kinds of educated choices, judgments, if you like, in order to do that. And so an aesthetic education for me is an opportunity to think through a model of education that the university, I think in general globally, has largely given up on, which is an opportunity to think through the aesthetic, another possibility for the human condition. And, there are many influences here, Hannah Arendt being one of them. I've just heard Lindsay Stonebridge do a wonderful lecture at Trinity College Dublin. She's writing a book on Hannah Arendt. And so there's so much going on in the humanities that points to an opportunity to cohere a discussion around an aesthetic education, which might be a breakup of mastery or sophistry. And I'm not saying that there's no place for mastery in the university. I wouldn't want a heart surgeon to give up on the possibility, especially if they're going to be working on this decrepit heart of mine. But, there may be places, there would be places for this, but also not to surrender entirely, as we did in 1985, to the immediate. And so that points to the question that you were pointing about duration. I'm trying to think about competing temporalities. And I do so in the last chapter of the book called The Double Futures of Post-apartheid Freedom, through an idiomatic formulation given to me by a jazz musician, Abdullah Ibrahim, who tells this wonderful story about a Saturday morning in Athlone. And I've told it so many times that I'm sure some of your audience would have heard me go on. And it's like my entire mythology is founded in this narrative. But it's a story about competing temporalities and jazz. And jazz, so he tells the story of a Saturday morning in Athlone. And it's in, there's a cutaway in the film by Chris Austin called The Brother with the Perfect Timing. And it's a story about these two brothers ambling down the street, smoking a joint. I don't know what the effects of this are, but apparently it slows you down. And behind her, there's a girl skipping. And behind her is a car that's accelerating. And he says, the brother passes the joint, scoops the girl out of the way. The car passes, takes the joint, and he takes a whiff. And he says, perfect timing, master musician. So the thing about the everyday and petty apartheid is that petty apartheid was created to create conditions of intensity that would lead to ongoing civil war, unending war. And what Abdullah is saying is, and Ibrahim is saying that in that anecdote about a Saturday morning in a township called Mannenberg, is that through music and an assemblage of music, there was an attempt to think about how not to collide. So an aesthetic education is a form of education that forestalls the collision. In other words, that knows that slapstick is available for all sorts of other purposes, if you like. And so I think that, an aesthetic education is something I want to propose as a way of proceeding, both to undo apartheid as a configuration, but also what it masks in a global condition of race, or what it reveals about a global condition of race and its deployment through devious, deceptive mastery, forms of mastery, and to figure out an education where there's a education of the senses to re-link to the kind of question of the perceptual worlds and the conceptual worlds that we're trying to build. So I want to have this as an affirmative statement about education, and not to give up on education. And aesthetic education seems to me an opportunity to create a space of leveling where, you know, we think together and we fail together and we explore and experiment, but that we reorient the human towards technology differently. In other words, we build a different relationship to the question of technology, rather than the kinds of anxiety producing debates that we're now having about artificial intelligence and so on. Marve, does that at least map some way out of which is a very important question for, I think, all of us in the humanities now, you know, because I think the endless talk of the crisis, as you were saying, you know, doesn't get us any further. And in fact, I just read a review, I haven't read the book yet, Libby Anker's newer book, you know, on the paradox of exclusion, you know, that we seem to have forgotten the potentialities of theory, that theory is not just accounting for or giving an account of, but an opportunity to think ahead.
Yes, thank you. It's definitely helpful. The question is simple, but the answer has to be very complex.
Thank you for that. Teang, can you ask the next question, please?
Sure. Professor, thank you so much for the really enriching talk, and I think yeah, I don't know where to begin because there are so many things to it, and I think part of it I wanted to know was I'm being really vague, but how do we create spaces of sense training, and what can we make out of music and art in your understanding of undoing the apartheid? Thank you.
Yeah, it's such an important question. You know, I mean, let me answer this question with a little practical kind of recount of what we're doing to think about what this problem of the sensory order and its breakup. There are three broad areas of our aesthetic inquiry and the Center for Humanities Research. The first of these is documentary film. And, you know, there's a burgeoning scene of documentary film across the African continent. And what's interesting is that when you think about, you know, an earlier generation in the 60s, Semene Usman, you know, maybe even later, Jibril Diop Mambeti, you know, all these great filmmakers that came mainly out of West Africa, who produced a cinematic language that was very distinct. Now, you know, one might call it, you know, an African film cinematic language, but actually it was a reorganization of the time of cinema. And so there was a very long conversation, you know, threaded through debates in Marxism, threaded through critiques of neocolonialism, threaded through the problems that confronted decolonization in its first iterations after independence. That cinematic tradition was actually the site of the most public intellectual conversation. And the documentary film for me holds out the promise of thinking about what is its film language. You know, what is its film language that allows us to think the present and our way out of the predicaments that we find ourselves in, all those aparias that we find ourselves. So one of the things we did in the center, we set up the documentary film class. It's taught by Khalid Shamiz and Francois Fuster, and everybody had to take it. And it's funny because when you put professors and graduate students and sometimes undergraduate students in the same room, the professors show up as pretty inept at like doing anything technical. It's not just about phones and that. It's actually like, how do you use an edit suite? How do you use a camera, you know, etc. Enough said, I need my job tomorrow, so I won't go down that path. But it was an opportunity of learning to learn. You know, and so we all had to make films, and you know, it's now going to be broadcast on Cape Town Community TV, which has 1.5 million viewers. So it just gives you the sense, right? Now, the film that I ended up making, which is not very good, but the characters are, and it's about a cinema in Athlone called the Kismet Cinema, And the word kismet traveled, from, the Persia into India, along the east coast of Africa, carrying with it this baggage of fate and destiny, until it arrived in Cape Town on the Cape Flats and came to signal the bioscope, or that's the name we give to the cinema here. And so it's a film that talks about how the cinema became a site of jazz experimentation and broke up the racial geographies of an area that was demarcated and segregated racially by putting people on the same stage and playing musical forms that became iconic in the Western Cape. I mean, Abdullah Ibrahim is a product of that in many ways, but Winston Mankunku, Sylvia Mdonyelwa, these fantastic jazz musicians who had thought about, timing and arriving in all sorts of complicated ways. So that's the one thing. The second is the puppet. I had joined Handspring Puppet Company as the chair. Sometimes I say I joined them as the puppet, but that's not entirely the case. I was the chair of the trust. And there was a young group of puppeteers from Masipumelele, a township just outside of Cape Town, who had worked on building the war horses. Some of you may have seen them. They traveled around the world as part of the British National Theatre, Michael Mopurgo children's story that got translated into a theatrical work. Now, Handspring had worked with Kentridge and a whole number of others, but the idea was to think about the puppet as midway between the human and the machine. And yeah, I'm thinking about Masahiro Mori's essay on, the robotics scholar in Japan, who, if you remember that diagram, and Lydia Liu in her wonderful book called The Freudian Robot reproduces that drawing. And for a long time, I kept looking at this thing, couldn't make sense of it. I was like, I'm terrible at geometry and diagrams. But then noticed that beyond the uncanny valley is the Bunraku puppetry traditions from Japan, which is adapted by Handspring. It's a tradition so they bring together different traditions of puppetry arts, including Malian, Sogolan theater, Bunraku. The puppeteer and the puppet are together. And the work of the puppeteer is to breathe life into the object, to keep the object alive on stage. And so we've built a laboratory of kinetic objects to think our way out of stasis. And the divided city is a city of stasis. And we're saying that there's a way in which the orchestration of the puppet might help us to think about this reorientation to technology, but might also help us to think our way out of this predicament of stasis, which is apartheid's inheritance, which is endless civil war, if you like. I mean, Nicole Leroux makes this point in the book, The Divided City, that stasis is the condition for endless civil war and unending war. And then thirdly, jazz, partly because we are a port city that brings together musical forms from the Indian and Atlantic Ocean worlds. But also the Cape was a slave holding. It's one of the few places on the continent that is a slave receiving society. And you remember in 1834, when slavery is abolished here, it is also abolished in the Caribbean. We know the Caribbean, but we often forget the Cape Colony and Madagascar was the other place, right? And so there's something about the Cape which then drew someone like John Herschel, who arrives at the Cape on the eve of the end of slavery, abolition of slavery, and in the same period that Afrikaner nationalism's mythology starts about the chosen people. And there's a debate about where it begins and so on, but there's a conflation of all these elements. And John Herschel comes to map the southern skies here, and that's when he's visited by Darwin. And the word photography is invented soon after. Herschel discovers the chemical that will help to fix images. And in 1839, proclaims not only the word photography, but also predicts the moving image. So there's something about the Cape, but to think that Cape, that scientific Cape, through the idiom of jazz, and through its movements and temporalities and orchestrations. So we try to set up these relational projects in the kinetic arts to think about movement out of stasis.
Patrick, can I ask a short follow-up question because it's related to this? So would you say that you have a preference for more embodied or performative forms of arts over literature when you conceptualize this aesthetic education?
That great question. So the book actually, enacts many of these kinetic techniques, but it is deeply invested in the poetic and the literary. So, the Seamus Heaney, Kyo Troy runs through the whole book. And even where it serves as an epigraph, it's trying to think about Heaney's desire in that, about sailing out of the bad dream of our past. And I love that formulation so much. It's not just about, reaching the further shore, as he says, but knowing that we can only reach the further shore with a sense of blindness, given where we are, given the wound of partition, the poisoned wound of partition. So that's certainly, a key element to it. The second is Richard Reeves' novel, Emergency Continued. I had not read that novel for many years, partly because Reeves was both an educator to many people in my family, and he taught Latin. He was one of the few teachers to teach Latin, which allowed many people to enter medicine and law and so on from schools that were segregated. Reeves, that novel, I decided to look into it when Adam Sykes, who is a colleague of ours who visited Cape Town and the center, did a paper called Study and Revolt. And in that paper, he asked, so what will we do with school? And it was the question that the students missed in 1985, and which Reeves is trying to ask us to think about through his novel. So he takes the opening chapter of this book, rehearses Richard Reeves' Emergency Continued as the condition of the post-apartheid, as the condition of generational conflict, of endless war, of reconfigurations and reconstellations of race, class cleavages, intensified gender and generational conflicts. He's anticipating and he's asking whether education might offer us something to exit that script. And then, of course, the three plays, which return to Goethe, Buchner, Jarry, that remakes them as theatrical works in the present. And then, of course, in the end, I go back to cinema and jazz. So it's trying to hold like the whole sensory world that would have occupied me as a person growing up under apartheid, and saying that the sensory world was a place both for theorizing, but for also enacting and, a different set of possibilities and futures. Something that I think we have lost track of. So you can see the madness of this book, right? It's trying to write a book in the general humanities and saying that we actually are disciplines that belong in a consilience of some sort, that there might be an object which we share, albeit not in common, but that at least is a conversation worth having. So rather than propose the unending war of the disciplines of the humanities, is to suggest a way to think about consilience as a way to talk about what we share but not in common.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask a next question, and it has to do with something you mentioned about the re-enchantment of key concepts animating our political thought. So I'm going to give the example of freedom and the way it is used by the far right in the US and by market fundamentalists. So how does this effort of re-enchanting political concepts connect with hope, imagination, and present-day enactment of change? If you forgive my turn of phrase, if an education of desire is needed, how can our desires educate our hope?
So let me start with the prior kind of sentiment in the question, which is about freedom. I think we've become too complacent around this term. And I was thinking about, the late Tejo Molan Olanian, as a scholar who taught at Wisconsin, who had been, I think, early education in Nigeria, and we tragically lost him a few years ago. but I was with him on a panel in Sharjah, and I was absolutely astounded at his insistence that we need to recuperate a concept of freedom that that has been too easily surrendered to very, very devious and deceptive forms of political mobilizations. And in the book, the reason for returning to the question of slavery and the slave is to insist that the concept of freedom that we have as the viable concept for the human condition is the one that would have to take seriously the question of the slave. So the slave is not simply a point of departure in the book. The slave is the very condition by which we come to think about the concept of freedom. And in that way, I want to suggest that, it's abuse and appropriation and it's manhandling, if you like, in the kind of marketized logic of neoliberalism and so on, is actually deceitful because it refuses to put in play the condition of the slave. Now, I'm thinking here about Norbert Wiener and his book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which 2 years after writing on cybernetics and producing that doctrine, which became a doctrine, for automated machines, is like the current stuff around AI, deeply worried about what will happen here. And one of the things he does is to talk about these automated machines and a return to slavery. So for him, slavery is never over in that sense because of its machinic transferal over 200 years. And it is always latent in these kind of technological shifts that happen in our modernity. And so to recall the figure of the slave is to make possible a return to a concept of freedom that is not simply available, but will have to be argued for and insisted upon in its kind of complexity, but that we should not be complacent about. And I think often what has happened is that in becoming complacent around some of these concepts, thinking that we've already accomplished this, we've already explained this, we have surrendered them to forms of political instrumentalization that I'm deeply worried about. So that's why, in South Africa, we don't talk in the language of freedom. Yet in the 80s, it was a term that was available in all the freedom songs and so on, So already by giving it up, we've surrendered the ground, if you like, for its appropriation. I'm saying, no, let's hold on to this term. We don't want to just give up this. We worked hard, over more than 100, 200 years to build its resourcefulness for thinking our way out of oppressive conditions. Why do we want to surrender it now so easily and so readily? And that's what I'm hoping, to use the word hope again. You see, there's lots of hoping here. So the question of hope, Su Ming-Ku, who had a discussion of this book early on when it was launched by Polity, reminded me in her discussion that for Heaney in The Cure at Troy, hope is not simply optimism. Hope is something you work for. And that is the political traditions that I know that brought about the end of apartheid. Is a kind of hope in the post-apartheid that had to be worked for, that had to be orchestrated, there's a grind to it, if you like. But there's a joyfulness about it as well. There's a deeply passionate kind of sense of pursuit, and that's what I'm calling thinking ahead. So I don't want to surrender the terms of long, periods of invention and creation. And I think what we ought to do is reinvent those terms, is not to give them up, but to reinvent them. But to keep that genealogy that I'm saying inaugurates the predicament of our modernity that is marked by the modernization of the idea of race. So rather than seeing race as some kind of regressive form, is to actually suggest that through its technological emergence, as Stigler would say, we have actually modernized the concept of race. And therefore, its intensification and its violence are even more telling in our contemporary world than they might have been even under something like apartheid.
Thank you very much for that response. Mervik, can you take the next question?
Sure. Could you discuss the ways in which apartheid is reenacted and continued? In other words, could you say a bit more about apartheid's endlessness? Yeah. How does this operative cycle in South Africa echo other ways of justifying and enforcing unequal and oppressive orders like colonialism or neoliberalism?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And, one of the inspirations behind a lot of what I've done in my own work has been this essay by Derrida called Racism's Last Word. And, that art collection, which was opened in 1983 in Paris and then circulated around and 40 countries, I think, was opened with that essay, with that piece called Racism's Last Word. And there's a debate, an interesting debate, in fact, that was republished in an edited volume by Henry Louis Gates called Race, Writing and Difference, and includes Rob Nixon and Anne McClintock's response, and then Derrida's rejoinder to that called But Beyond. Now, the thing about that is he has this formulation in there. He says apartheid is racism's last word. And then he hastily adds to that, the last of many. In other words, there's something about its emergence that masks what is driving its kind of unfold, its intensification over time. And I think when he says that apartheid was a European creation, he's not speaking literally there, but he's saying there are things about its racial formation that cannot be isolated, dispatched, even cauterized in a place called South Africa, because it belongs to the world. In the same way that fascism came to belong to the world as a problem, apartheid is a problem of the world. And for many years, that's what encouraged so many people in the struggle against apartheid, is that it was something that could be seen across the world as a problem of the modernization of race. Now, it is true that this word has traveled, and we can now, increasingly, people talk about global apartheid, and so this word is around, and it is invoked often to mark difference of one form or the other, to register its atrocity, and it carries with it, not just South Africa's experience, but an experience of this inheritance of the underbelly of our modernity. And so I think there's something that is persistent in the name apartheid, and that's the important thing. It's what persists in its name. And I want to suggest that what persists is this idea of partitioning, that political rationality is what persists. So that when I look at, so many of the major national crises that we face in the world today, partition is a ready-made solution to many of those problems, but they produce a dire consequence. We just need to think about Sudan here, there's so many examples of this, where this, so apartheid is a strange word. It's a watchword for difference, but it is also the worry about what lies ahead. And for many of the 20th century Black Atlantic thinkers of race, I'm thinking about South Africa, where in the early 1900s, you had some phenomenal scholars, intellectuals, political thinkers, Saul Plaatje, Silas Modiri Molema, Charlotte Maxeke, in conversation, Gandhi, in conversation with Du Bois and Booker T. Washington across the Atlantic Ocean, in conversation with emerging intellectual traditions in Britain and Europe more generally, but also Asia, that for many of them, on the horizon, looking forward beyond the kind of ends of the 19th century was the problem of a form of race that was coming at them. And they, I mean, in many of their writings, they are all thinking ahead about the fact that they thought they could escape race through education. That if you just had enough education, you would get beyond your station in life. And then came the 1900s and the revolution in mnemotechnic objects, in communication technologies, and the onset of a more aggressive form of colonialism after the First World War, marked by an imperial kind of extractive global economic order. And they thought that they were in deep trouble. They had misapprehended the problem of race as a recurring problem. So South Africa is not done with the question of apartheid. That doesn't mean, I'm not trying to now suggest that, you know, we shouldn't have had a 94 when it was, I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm saying that we thought about apartheid as a particular kind of problem. And it's a very sophisticated discourse. The debate between nationalists and Marxists, you know, the feminist critique that emerged in the 80s and 90s around apartheid, those are very, very important, very deeply and well thought through critiques. But something about its aftermath after 94 shows that it was not, there was something wanting in the critique of apartheid. And it's that this book is trying to grapple with, is what was found wanting in the critique of apartheid that we might yet have to set to work on, that we might yet have to undo. And I think it's this form of race that permeated the everyday, the banal everyday form of race that you know is there. And I often think about this as a kind of doubling effect, you know. So the book opens with the double binds of apartheid and it ends with the double futures of post-apartheid freedom. And I'm reminded of Jordan Peele's film, Us, you know, which is this, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's an incredible film and very carefully staged as a cinematic work. But Us basically doubles as US. Everything in that film has a doubling effect, right? And that's somehow trying to get at the experience of race. So just the last point on this, Mary. I mean, Du Bois also, in his double consciousness, was trying to think through this problem. And it's very interesting because from what I learned from his biographer and his biography, is that in 1893, when he went to Germany, he went to see a production of Faust 2. So what he saw in the theater is not the split between desire and the intellectual pursuits of the human. What he saw there was double consciousness. So he, you know, when we go to the theater, what we see unfolding in the staging before us is also involves a spectatorial kind of engagement, a theorization, if you like, you know, with the theatrical. And in that sense, I think that, you know, what Du Bois walks out of that theater, I can imagine he must have had a look of horror on his face, because what you would have seen is a condition of race that had not only been unresolved by the post-slavery period, but that was still coming at them on the horizon.
Thank you very much, Professor Premesh, for this very interesting lecture. I'd like to remind our viewers that Polity is offering 20% discount on his book, Undoing Apartheid. All you have to do is go to their website and use the code P2022 to get a 20% discount. And in the name of Theory for the Margins and other members of our team, we'd like to thank you for your participation and thank you our audience for being here today.
So can I just say thank you very, very much as well. Yeah, it's a really, I really appreciate it. It's a really wonderful way to end this evening.
Thank you so much. You've given us a lot of food for thought.
Thank you. Okay, take care.
Take care.
Bye.